Welcome back to another Algebra 2 video. I'm Mr. Hibble. Today we are looking at the quadratic formulas. The quadratic formula is simply this equation. As long as we have a quadratic in what's known as standard form, remember standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c, where we can solve that quadratic as long as that quadratic is equal to 0. Okay? That's where the A, B, and C come from, and we're just going to be plugging into that. One thing I do want to point out is what is under the square root. That is what is known as the discriminant. Okay, the discriminant plays a role in this formula where it actually allows us to determine the amount of solutions. Okay, so the discriminant is what was under the square root, which is b squared minus 4ac. Let's look at determining the amount of solutions these three quadratics would have. So if I were to use our quadratic formula here, negative b plus or minus our square root of, b squared minus 4ac, so take my b squared, which is negative 2 in this case. Make sure you square that. We do want to be using parentheses for this stuff. Minus 4 times our a value of 6 and our c value of negative 3. From there, all you're going to do is you're going to go into Desmos. And when you do that, you can just type in that entire statement. You can take negative 2, make sure you square it to find each of these values. What we end up getting for this first one is 76. Same process for the next two. You take your b value, you square it, b squared minus 4 times our a times our c. Type it into Desmos and see what value you get. In this case, the middle one comes out to be 0. Third case, b squared minus 4 times a times c. Type that one in. I don't remember what that one gives me off the top of my head, so I do need to type that one in real quick. 1 squared minus 4 times negative 5 times negative 2 gives us negative 39. Okay, so now we have our three values. So what this does is this tells us the amount of solutions. Remember, a solution is the same thing as an x-intercept. So if you were to type in these functions into Desmos or something, you could look at the amount of x-intercepts they have. Well, the first equation, when I type it in, when we had a positive discriminant, I'm seeing it crosses the x-axis twice. That would mean we get two solutions whenever the discriminant is positive. Give me one sec. All right, sorry for the interruption. Picking up where we left off. So we noticed that the first discriminant value was positive. And when we typed that into Desmos, we saw there was two x-intercepts, right? Solutions and x-intercepts are the same. So we found two real solutions whenever you get a positive discriminant, okay? Two real solutions. When you get 0 as your discriminant, again, you could type that into Desmos to see what that one looks like. 4x squared minus 8x plus 4. Notice that's touching your x-axis once. So when we have a discriminant of 0, you'll get one real solution. And if you were to type in the bottom one, what you would notice is it doesn't even touch the x-axis, meaning we get no real solutions. Okay, so the value of our discriminant tells us how many solutions, and we determine the amount based off of whether it's positive, negative, or 0. One thing I do want to note is the reason we get these different types of solutions is based off of the plus or minus in front of the square root, as well as the square root itself. For example, if we had a negative value as our discriminant, that would mean there's a negative under the square root. Negative square roots, remember, give us imaginary values. So what I would end up getting if my discriminant is 0 is we actually get imaginary solutions instead. So make sure when you're typing in or writing out no solutions, make sure you're saying no real solutions. There are solutions that exist. They are just imaginary. Let's continue now to doing the actual quadratic formula. So looking at the quadratic formula, we have this equation 4x squared plus 19x minus 5. If you need to label your A, B, and C, feel free to do that. And then I'm just going to plug in. Notice the first B value is negative in the formula, so I'm going to put a minus sign. Then my B value, and I just keep following it. There's the plus or minus. Inside, we have the discriminant, 19 squared minus 4 times A times C. Make sure you're bringing the signs with. And then we have 2 times A on the bottom, which is 2 times 4. The only one that does not need parentheses when you go through this is the first B value, that negative B on top. The other ones, make sure you include parentheses. Otherwise, if you're using Desmos to help simplify this stuff or your calculator, it would do it correctly. So include parentheses on the bottom and under the square root. Well, in order to simplify this, we're not just going to type in the entire thing. We only want to type in part of this. The part that we're going to type in is what is underneath the square root. We're going to type in the discriminant just like we were before. So, okay, we get a value of 441. Notice when I typed it in, I did not include the square root. I simply did what was underneath. Realize the bottom gives us 8. 2 times 4 there. Well, we want to try and simplify this. In order to simplify it, we have a square root of 441. Type that in. Let's see if it simplifies. In this case, it does. So I get negative 19 plus or minus 21 all over 8. Remember what plus or minus does. Plus or minus gives us 2 different solutions. So I'm going to get 2 different values for x right now. The first one would be negative 19 plus 21 all over 8. The second one would be when you are subtracting instead. One is the plus case, the other is the minus case. You could type both those fractions into Desmos to see what they simplify to. The first one would give you 1/4 or 0.25. The second one, when you type that one in, would give you negative 5 is what I get. Okay, there's the basic process. But this process can get more challenging. Let's look at this for number 2. Rewriting our quadratic formula if we need it. So plugging in x equals negative b. Notice I have a negative from the formula, and now my b value is negative 3. Well, realize that double minus there, what's going to happen is it's now going to be a plus 3 instead. Plug into each of the different parts. Be careful with your signs and your use of parentheses. Notice here there is nothing in front of x squared. Make sure you use the number in front. So if there is nothing there, we're plugging in a 1. Simplify the inside. Type the inside into Desmos to see what that gives us. Let's do that right now. In this case, that'd be negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10, which gives me negative 31. Okay, well, notice what we have, square root of 31. You could try and simplify that. Try to take the square root of 31, but that doesn't work. Square root of negative 31 is undefined. So you might try and take 31 and divide it by the perfect squares lower than it to see if any of those go in, but none of the perfect squares go in. So I can't simplify the 31. So the 31 is going to stay the same, but because it's negative, right? Remember, square roots of negatives give us an I. We have 2 imaginary solutions on this one because our discriminant was negative. No real solutions, but 2 imaginary. That is another case that might happen. First one, it simplified nicely. We knew the square root. Second one, it was a negative square root. Make sure you replace the negative with I. The third thing we might need to do when we go through this process, Okay, let's go ahead and plug in real quick. Let's see what we get. Okay, there's my plugged in form, 2 times a now. And then we could simplify the inside. Let's see what this one gives us when we type it in. 2 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3 gives me negative 20 now. All over 4. Okay, well, again, you can check to see if the square root of 20 is nice, but it's not in this case. So now let's try and simplify it, right? Remember simplifying radicals, simplifying square roots. You divide by the perfect squares lower than it. So divide by 16, divide by 9, divide by 4. Notice that 4 goes in. So what we can do now is the square root of 20 is the same thing as square root of 4 times square root of 5. Okay, but remember, the square root of 4 gives me a value of 2, where the square root of 5, we don't know that one, so it stays the same. So now my new equation becomes negative 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 5 all over 4. But one other thing you have to pay attention to. The square root of 20, we had the square root of negative 20. So don't forget, square roots of negatives, you do need to include the I. If you put this answer on a test or a quiz, I am okay with that. But please realize we could actually simplify this. What we could do is, because of this 2 in front, this 2 in front of the radical and this 4 on bottom, those values can actually simplify. You can take 2 and divide it by 4. 2 divided by 4 gives us 1/2. So the value of 2 in front becomes 1. The value in front of I becomes 1. And the value on bottom now becomes 2. Realize what's under the square root does not get divided. It is only those other pieces. That is the 3.6 video quadratic formula as well as discriminant. Thank you for watching.